Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. He comes to us from the UK, actually from Wales. Well, I think my first guest, or one of my few guests from Wales. His name is Mark Brake, Brake. And if you're watching this on Rumble, Rockfin, or X, you will see the cover to his new book. It was just released in Amazon in the States 2 days ago. And the full title of the book is The Science of the Beatles, the Technology and Theory Behind the Music and Lyrics. And it should be something of interest to anybody. I grew up listening to Beatles, the White Album, so many of these songs still about. But this is not Mark's first book. He's actually written, he tells me this is his 28th book, and you can see some of them. I'll put a link to his Amazon page here in the US. But he's written on a lot of topics that I'm interested in. Some of the other titles are Science of Star Wars, The Science of Harry Potter, The Science of Star Trek, The Science of Doctor Who, Science of James Bond, Jurassic World. These are all science-themed books on these great subjects. The Science of Sherlock Holmes. But like I said, Science of the Mandalorian. Today, we're going to be talking about the Science of the Beatles. Still one of the most important bands ever, really. And there's a lot to talk about. So Mark Brake, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, William.
For people who haven't heard of your other books, your background, you said that you were a professor as well. Maybe you can talk about your background, your books, and what led up to the research and writing of this book, The Science of the Beatles.
Yeah, the professorial chair that I occupied at university was the topic was I was a professor of science communication, so that's very much about science in the public domain, and in particular, my interest was looking at fact and fiction and the science that fact and fiction contain and the way in which science is disseminated through popular culture, which is why I did the Star Wars book and the Star Trek book, because most people in the world get their diet of science through science fiction or some popular forms of fiction or film or whatever it might be. So, I've been writing books of that sort since about 2006, 2007, I think. And as you said, I've covered all those topics because they're of particular interest to me, because a lot of them are huge franchises. And as a result of that, they're going to be communicating science to an awful lot of people. At the same time, I've also been a huge Beatles fan. I'm old enough to remember the Beatles, and I was alive when the songs came out. And my mother passed away at the age of 90 recently, a year or so ago. And I was going through some of the stuff associated with the stuff back home. And I found a kindergarten book a little news book that I'd put together at the age of this is about 1965. This is by the age of 7. And I'd done a news item on the Beatles. I was pleased that, although my artistic expression was rather limited, I was quite pleased to see that I actually got Paul McCartney down as a left-handed player, even though the rest of the art was somewhat lacking. So that kind of made me start thinking about, the Beatles, about their contribution. People often say whether they're overrated, don't really understand what it is that they did. So I thought it would be interesting to pay tribute to all intents and purposes, what are the greatest architects in music making, the writing, recording, and artistic presentation of popular music. They revolutionized many aspects of the music. They were lucky in some regards because they were pioneers, because a lot of that kind of stuff kicked off in 1960s. But they must have represented something, because the global sales of Beatles stuff is around about 600 million units, which is quite a lot.
Incredible. Billions.
Yeah. I also there's an interesting question. These days you see a lot of tribute acts, and because maybe the original group themselves have moved on or split up or whatever it might be, you see, and I started to wonder whether in the future, rather than getting the Beatles themselves, of course, because they may have passed, you may get, of course, tribute acts. In the same way, you get musical performances of Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven. Obviously, don't get the guys themselves. So I just started to wonder, when people look back in about 200 years' time at our culture, what music would have survived. And you can probably bet your bottom dollar it would be the Beatles, among others, but specifically the Beatles. In 2010, President Obama presented Paul McCartney with a Library of Congress George Gershwin Prize for Popular Song, and paid tribute to what he called McCartney as the most successful songwriter in history. But some of the things Obama said about McCartney I thought was interesting, about the way that the Beatles helped lay a soundtrack for a generation which was going through change in the 1960s. But also the fact that McCartney had composed 200 songs that had made the charts and that stayed on the charts for a cumulative total of 32 years, which is quite an incredible fact. So obviously signifies something. And talking about Beatle firsts, the Sgt. Pepper album is the first major rock concept album. In 1967, which is the same year as Sgt. Pepper's, they made a music video of Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane, which was one of the first music videos which pioneered, music videos for the MTV generation, which is a decade or more later. And of course, their recording techniques in terms of backward masking of reverse vocals and instruments, and the use of loops and sampling, and their global impact as part of the British invasion of America. There's all those things as well. There's the use of orchestral integration in songs like A Day in the Life, or of string quartets like in Yesterday and Eleanor Rigby. The use of the sitar from Indian music in Norwegian Wood, I think that's one of the first examples of it. And of course, the records they have in terms of the top Billboard, they're the top 5 Billboard hits, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in April of 1964, which I think has never been equaled. So they represent something which I thought is worth looking into.
They still resonate to this day. I think even as Americans, they're happy about the British invasion, by the way. Americans love British music still, but there is a phase where maybe men, maybe I can speak for women, they listen to the Beatles, they listen to their music, Sgt. Pepper's, Revolver, and the White Album, because the White Album's so different.
Yeah,
like almost all my friends, we all kind of had a time where we listened actually back when they had discs or whatever, vinyl or whatever. But that's another interesting thing in the science, is how it's morphed and all that stuff. But yeah, I mean, we're still talking about the Beatles. They're still important. You're right.
That's right. I mean, you could ask the question about why it was them and why at that particular time. I think it's a perfect storm of personal qualities of the band themselves and historical circumstance. Apparently, at the time of Beatlemania, or during the 60s, only 5% of people could name all the Rolling Stones, but 95% of people could identify all the Beatles. And I think that's a lot to do with not necessarily branding, but each member of the band had a distinct persona. There was the wit of John Lennon, the charm of Paul McCartney, there's the spiritual element of George Harrison, and the humor of Ringo. The kind of thing you see on interviews where they say, "How do you find America?" And they say, "We turned left at Greenland," that kind of thing. So also in terms of the quality of the songwriting, I think there's opposing temperaments where, John Lennon is kind of a more cynical character and McCartney's kind of more optimistic, which is an interesting blend, creates a kind of songwriting alchemy. They also did a huge amount of gigging in the late 50s and early 60s in Liverpool and in Hamburg. I understand they played something like 1,200 times before 1964, playing 8-hour sets 7 days a week, where they learned stagecraft and artistic innovation. And it far exceeds the amount of playing time that an ordinary band would have experienced. I think in terms of the timing of why then, a lot has been said about there being a cultural vacuum in America in the early 1960s after JFK's assassination. So JFK passes in late 63, and then the Beatles' arrival in America is early 1964. And there was an interesting documentary recently on Disney, wasn't it, called Beatles in 64, which catalogued a lot of that. I think Scorsese was interested in it. One of the people interviewed was David Lynch, talking about the fact that, the Ed Sullivan Show in 1964, which the Beatles appeared on, I think it was about 60% of the US population saw that. It reached about 73 million Americans and created almost instant superstardom, as you can imagine. Also, post-war boom in America and the rest of the West. By 1959, 35% of Americans were actually teenagers and had a lot of spending power. So you had the rise of youth culture, a kind of baby boom, a post-war economic boom as well, which creates a youth market. So there's that perfect storm of the individuals that they are and the timing of their appearance, which has got a lot to do with it, I suspect.
It's really incredible. I mean, it's really something that really changed. They changed the culture. I mean, I think that they were really cultural change agents more than reflecting the culture. Would you agree with that?
I think so. I mean, there's this interesting concept called remix culture. It's often associated with hip hop, but I think you could argue that it goes back to Picasso. Some of Picasso's paintings borrowed from African art. It's a kind of sampling of different artistic cultures. I think it's definitely true that the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were responsible for a remix culture where they combine or edit existing materials to make their own creative works. And of course, in a lot of those cases with the Beatles and the Stones, it's American music that they're remixing. They became hugely successful by remixing American music, which Elvis Presley did to some extent, and they just took it. I think they took it even further, creating a kind of new synthesis. And if you think about the first 5 albums of the Beatles before they actually started writing all their material, which was another revolutionary thing, they pioneered writing their own material. I think Hard Day's Night is the first album where all the songs are actually written by the band, in this case, the Beatles, where everybody else then copied that. But it's important that the Beatles were from Liverpool, which is a city port, so had a lot of imported music from America, which you couldn't otherwise buy in Britain. So they were open to that. I was going to say that out of the first 5 albums, most of the cover songs that the Beatles did were by American soul artists. But David Bowie said an interesting thing about what the British do with something when they know that the thing that they're doing doesn't belong to them, in this particular case, rock music. I think the British have been good at rock music, but they know they're not a rock nation, and rock and roll doesn't spring from their souls. So typically what British do is they try and do something with it to make them feel smug or good about what they're doing, but they know it's not original. So you get a lot of, not necessarily parody, but the British do it with a tongue-in-cheek. You think of the dancing and the posing of Mick Jagger. He's not entirely serious. Or the comedy camp of early Elton John. You know what I mean? Or
Right.
the Beatles stuff in particular, there's a lot of goofing about in Beatles music. I think it's important to realize, and a number of people have mentioned this, when they watch Get Back or they watch Let It Be, they see how much goofing there is. So that's an important thing as well, I think, to bear in mind. Yes, the Beatles are American music, but with a British twist.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's really incredible how they kind of cross fertilized each other. But also their influence. One of the interesting things I saw recently on an album was the name of George Martin, and it was the vinyl album, but it didn't have the names of the Beatles. It said produced by George Martin right on the top, like as if he
Yeah,
was almost the star. Maybe you can talk about him because he was a very sophisticated musician, is my understanding.
absolutely. I mean, he was a classically trained in piano and oboe. He was already head of Parlophone Records when he first met the Beatles. Importantly, the records he was responsible for before he met the Beatles were comedy records and novelty records. So in Britain, in the 1950s, there was a show called The Goon Show, which had a bunch of comedians, including Peter Sellers, who's probably better known internationally. And The Goon Show was very influential on Monty Python and Monty Python's sense of humor. But also, The Goon Show is very influential on George Martin and on the humor of the Beatles. So that goofing about we talked about, um, on Beatle albums and the creative play associated with producing the music is an important factor. And the fact that George Martin worked on those comedy novelty albums, as well as on the Beatle rock albums, says a lot about it. George Martin told the New York Times in 2003 that when he joined EMI, and I think Parlophone is a sub-label of EMI, he got a little bored of creating recordings in the studio which were just like completely faithful to the original. He just said he was like just taking photographs and he wanted to create an art, a more of a painted art, which prompted him to experiment. So the Beatles are lucky in a sense. They go into a guy who's also interested in experimentation and artistic representation. And so, yeah, George Martin was with him all the way through. Of course, many people have called him the fifth Beatle. He was there between 62 and 70, all the way through the 13 albums and the 22 singles.
Incredible, incredible.
But also, maybe in reference to you saw George Martin on some album, he was also responsible for doubling their initial input after they'd split up, because archive material or live material, which shows you how much the band actually worked in the early days, he collated a lot of that kind of stuff and put compilations out for Parlophone and EMI after the Beatles had split. And I think his expertise, people might wonder what science there is in the Beatles. It's to do with the trade craft of writing, creating, and presenting and recording popular music. And with George Martin, they've got an expert on the technology, even though the technology is quite basic. I think because he was prone to experimentation, he encouraged them to not think there'd been any walls or boundaries to what they did, and to use the technology to best realize the music and the songs, which I think is interesting.
It is, and it's really stands the test of time. People are still like Tomorrow Never Knows is incredible, and some of these I think you write in your book, like I think one of the later albums, I don't know if it's Sgt. Pepper or Revolver, they were going to invert all the normal sounds of instruments and tinker around with that. Like this is very much this remix riffing on standard noises. And also one of the things I was thinking about this comedy, I think that was the initial attraction of the Beatles, these young, they're kind of joking around all the time and mirthful. And I think that might have been part of the initial attraction to them, is that, they're always smiling and laughing and goofing around and doing comedy bits or,
That's
gags.
right. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's part of the infection of why, that they were so popular so early on. When you listen to a lot of people have a lot of respect for the later albums, the experimental stuff, like Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, and so on. But the early albums are really joyous in their enthusiasm. Don't forget that the very first album, Please Please Me, as I talk about in the book, was actually laid down in 24 hours in a single day, or rather in a single daytime, as it were. So I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. There's a tremendous amount of sense of fun. I was thinking about you talking about creativity. There's an excellent YouTube video that listeners might be interested in looking at, and it's a YouTube video. There's a guy, he's an educator from Britain. His name is Ken Robinson, and he talks about how people are often educated out of creativity.
Interesting.
He quotes Picasso talking about children are born artists, all of us, but the challenge is to remain an artist despite schooling. And it's an interesting TED talk, and he gives a couple of examples of how kids can be creative.
Is that him right there on screen?
That's the fella, yeah, that's
Okay.
him. And he talks about the fact that there's a nativity play going on. This is something that he evidenced himself. There's a nativity play going on, and these three kids have got to go up on the stage and present gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And they get kind of mixed up. And the first guy goes up and presents gold, second guy goes up and presents myrrh, and the third guy forgets what he has, because it's a funny word for a kid. And he just said, Frank sent this, which I think is a pretty nice improvisation when you can't remember. He also talks about the creativity of kids. There's a girl who otherwise doesn't pay attention in very academic subjects, but in art, she's entirely galvanized because she loves to paint. And the teacher goes up to her and says, what are you painting? And she says, I'm going to do a drawing of God. And the teacher says, well, nobody knows what God looks like. And she said, they will in a minute. You know, that kind of enthusiasm of not letting. I think there's an element of that creative play to the Beatles approach. So you mentioned Tomorrow Never Knows. John Lennon goes to George Martin, I should say, and says he wants to sound like 1,000 monks chanting on top of a mountain. I mean, that's a challenge. That kind of not being put off necessarily by not being formally trained. They were trained in music, so they have that attitude, that creative attitude, where they're not necessarily being unschooled. Sorry, I should say schooled out of creativity. I think that's very important. So they have that spirit of invention. Some people refer to masters of flow, some people being masters of flow, people who are in the zone and can continue to be in the zone, and something might take them out of the zone. I think Steve Jobs was one of those where he says, flow artists ship, they get things done. And a good example of that with the Beatles, with that last track on Sgt. Pepper's A Day in the Life, which is this huge effort. They put this song together from disparate parts. Lennon had written most of it, and then McCartney had a middle section, the one about going upstairs and have a smoke, and somebody spoke in him, that bit. Even though it didn't fit, Lennon's attitude was, that'll do, a kind of get things done attitude. It didn't necessarily matter that it was different tempo or slightly jazzy. It takes the song, it's a perfect middle eight in that sense. You know what I mean? So that creativity, them being untrained in music, and that creative spirit, I think, is important, along with the goofing about, because it fits in with the goofing about as well.
They're playing the music. They're so young too. One of the things you forget is like these guys are in their early 20s, if that, like in this superstardom and these making these creative works. Very young.
You know, I often think that old adage about people being at their creative peak at 27 stems from, in part, the Beatles being roughly 27 when they made Sgt. Pepper. I think it was run with it. Lennon's about 27 when they made Sgt. Pepper. So, yeah, I think it's all to do with play.
And sophistication too. Like these songs are just brilliant. I mean, it had to be Martin's influence in a lot of ways. Is that he, and apparently I've talked to other people who said his producing is like crisp and clean, and there's no background noise, or it's not sloppy at all. It's like completely well done from producer to producer. It's like this guy's obviously super genius or something like that. But yeah, I mean, Why do you think they stopped touring in '66? It's kind of one of the great mysteries of the Beatles.
I think they were bored. I mean, they had. If you look at the early days, well, I mentioned to you, didn't I, 1,200 hours of playing in Hamburg. It's probably more than actually. I'm probably underselling it. But the fact they had these 7 days a week, 8 hours a day, and then when they became successful at Beatlemania all around the world, grueling touring schedules. Beatlemania means there's a cacophony. Now, of course, they also did one of the first stadium gigs at Shea Stadium. So they got these very grueling tour schedules, which I think became a bit of a drag. I think McCartney was in favour of continuing, but a lot of the other band members, I think, felt a little bit jaded by that. It's important to their development because once they'd abandoned touring, and I think it was Brian Epstein, their manager, who promised them they wouldn't have to tour any longer, they no longer needed to compose songs which needed to be played live. So, with the guidance of George Martin, they turned Abbey Road into an audio lab, really, and pushed the boundaries. We talk about creative play and imagination. They used their imagination and they used the recording studio as an instrument and conjured up new sounds, instrument by instrument, layer by layer, track by track, even though, of course, the technology is rather limited. And I think that the methods they did. So if you've got, as far as I understand it anyway, if you've got two 4-track machines, you're obviously limited. You can only put 4 tracks on the one machine. But if you have two 4-track machines, you can put the 4 tracks on the first 4-track machine, and all those 4 tracks on the first track of the second, if you get my drift.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the kind of thing that they had to do. But I think it's the creativity and imagination in the innovations in songwriting and production which come first, and then seeing the way in which George Martin, the technology, can accommodate the ideas.
Right. And I mean their music evolved, right? I mean, they're clearly going from some kind of pop band to a sophisticated band. I mean, how did these changes come about, even lyrically and technically?
Yeah, well, a good example, even though a good example is Yellow Submarine. I mean, I know a lot of people think that Yellow Submarine lets the Beatles down, but I think, given everything we've been talking about so far, William, I think Yellow Submarine is absolutely quintessential Beatles. A lot of people think it's a bit daft. I think you have a lot of, I don't know, you have to have a lot of gall to release a song like Yellow Submarine. It's very simple, it's jolly, it's melodic, it appeals to all demographics. In 2022, a previously unreleased demo was put out, which features an early demo of John Lennon singing the basic melody to Yellow Submarine. It's very sparse and it's very melancholic, really. It's all about coming from Liverpool. And the way in which they changed the tone of that song into like a throwaway novelty song, going back again into George Martin's background. Just a song about sailing in a yellow submersible, for heaven's sake. But there's that goofy but futuristic sound collage, which is in the mix there. There's the bells, the chains, I think they got hooters and whistles. There's a tin bath, a cash till, the sound of ocean waves, which has got George Harrison swirling water under a bathtub. There's the rattling of change, which sounds like something from Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. All those things which produce this kind of cacophony. They also do the famous thing about they wanted brass on the track. So they find brass band recordings, which are big in the UK. I'm not sure what it's like in the States. Brass band recordings, which they basically throw up in the air and they land, they splice them up and then put something together. All that kind of it's very attention grabbing stuff, but it's a very heady mix. And it's a conversion of something which is very basic in the demo, but innovation in the recording studio turns into something entirely different. I think that's an example.
That's part of their experimental stuff, like the White Album. You have a whole chapter in your book about the White Album, which still resonates. It's incredible. Like, I don't know if they were thinking about that album, how it would reverberate through the world, really. Because I mean, I'm all my friends and stuff. I've listened to the White Album, Manson, obviously that reference, and
It's a kind of warts and all album, isn't it? I see one sees on social media a lot. If people are talking about music, they're talking about bands and they're talking about albums, they often say, what's the best 3-album run in history? And they might cite some examples. And maybe, I know, 3 albums by Pink Floyd, whoever it might be. But with the Beatles, there are a number of different 3-album runs you could pick. It could be Rubber Soul, Revolver, and Sgt. Pepper, or Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, and the White Album. The White Album generally is regarded as more warts and all than the very polished Rubber Soul, Revolver, and Sgt. Pepper that came before it. But I think that's what people like about the White Album, is this. I read somebody talking in the New Yorker recently about, or in the last year or so, about it being a kind of postmodern classic. You know, it's very strange, and it's like this massive beast, which has got these. You know, George Martin said, I think he was not particularly happy about the White Album. He felt that it could have made one good album, like Peerless, like the 3 that came before. But I think it's the weirdness of the White Album.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Sprawling nature of it. There's some very weird stuff on there, isn't there?
Dark.
Very dark. Like
sexual stuff, murder, But Blackbird is brilliant,
Blackbird, which has recently been recorded by Beyonce.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she recorded on Cowboy Carter. And I think I'm right in saying that the original acoustic track from the Beatles recording on the White Album is used by Beyonce on her version of Blackbird.
There you go.
There's also the Charles Manson Association, of course, with Piggies, which shows you how dark some elements of the White Album were.
Piggy, what's the lyrics are really intense, see the piggy in the road or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's taken from George Orwell's 1984. I don't know. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Not 94.
No. I'm trying to remember the lyrics. I'm going to go listen to the White Album after we're done. Listen to it again because I haven't listened to it in decades. But
you remember an Animal Farm? What happens is that the animals get fed up of living on a farm run by humans, so they overthrow the humans, and then the animals run the farm themselves. But the pigs take control.
Right, Napoleon takes control, right?
Yes, exactly. The pigs take control of the farm and then start behaving like humans, and the pigs are the ones in control. And I think that's George Harrison's reference to Animal Farm. It seemed like
incredible stuff. I mean, and so much going on in the culture too. That this White Album is a reflection of at least in the States, the '60s were just incredibly turbulent here. I mean, after Kennedy's death, it was like political assassination, MLK, Vietnam, drugs, LSD. So a reflection of like this new psychedelic culture, term coined by Huxley. It's just and the Beatles drank all that stuff in. I mean,
yes, absolutely. I mean, they're symbiotic with the '60s, aren't they? And the music evolved as the decade advanced. They got that consonance with the cultural context in the early '60s, where there's that like joyous enthusiasm and that kind of contagious carefree music at the beginning, which then made way for marijuana soaked music in the mid '60s, looking for deeper meaning, and then engaging with the counterculture stuff in the late '60s. I think the music mirrors all that. Like All You Need Is Love is a good example of that. And a lot. I mean, I think to some extent, when their manager died, when Brian Epstein died, which is their link back to the city of Liverpool, and they enjoyed a kind of hive mind affinity of self-support and genial rivalry, and a shared. In Britain, we call people from Liverpool Scousers, and the Beatles very much had a Scouse outlook on life. It's kind of anti-establishment. It's a very un-English city in many ways, because 3/4 of the population of Liverpool can trace ancestry to Ireland, because a lot of the Irish came over during the famine. So when they were decoupled from Brian Epstein and Liverpool, I think that's when they maybe started to fall apart a little.
What was the actual date of the so-called dissolution of the Beatles? Was it 1970?
1970, year-wise, yeah, I couldn't tell you what the exact date was, but I think it was a process, an evolving process after the death of Brian Epstein. I think, he got very strong personalities, so I think in the recording studio, often things could get tense. In fact, I think I'm right in saying, on one occasion, Ringo got fed up of it, left the band, and went on holiday in Turkey, which I think I'm right in saying he then, somebody was showing him something to do with, a kind of Jacques Cousteau Life of the Octopus Underwater. This is where he wrote Octopus's Garden, his experience of that holiday. Anyway, they soon managed to cajole him to come back. But there were a lot of that kind of thing. McCartney, though, is the main instigator. McCartney's the workaholic. As I've seen Ringo talk in interviews about the fact that him and John Lennon would just be sunning it by the side of a swimming pool, even though, of course, that's very dangerous in Britain, if you can actually find a bit of sun. But they would be sunning it. McCartney would ring them and say, "It's time to come back to the studio, lads. We have to make another album." So, yeah, they did. So it was the unfolding of the Beatles was over a reasonable period of years, really, but especially after Brian Epstein, I think.
Epstein he was the kind of part of the glue that held them together.
Yeah.
What Beatles song, going back to science, what Beatles song do scientists say is their most catchy among their other catchy songs, which are all catchy, it seem to be?
Well, I think that it makes people wonder, doesn't it, sometimes, what scientists actually do for a living when they apparently some scientists and researchers at the Max Planck Institute in Germany listened to about 700 hit songs and 80,000 chord progressions in those songs. And their job was to look for the perfect pop song. Some of the highlights they talked about was the middle section of Lou Reed's A Perfect Day. Special mention goes to the Beach Boys' God Only Knows and to Nina Simone's Cinema, and all of which are brilliant songs, of course. But apparently, you have to depend on the Beatles to find the perfect pop song from intro to outro. And in their opinion, it was Oh Bloody Oblada.
Wow.
Yeah.
From the White Album, right?
Yeah, from the White Album. Another good example, isn't it? From the White Album. Apparently, now, if your listeners have this experience, I have this theory about what you might call earworms. The kind of song you get into your head that you simply can't get it out. And that song may be easy to recall or simply hard to forget and be slightly annoying. And I have this kind of pecking order of earworms, and the top of my earworm list is the Macarena. If you sing that, it'll probably drive out most other things. Well, Oblidi Oblada's got to be in that top 10 there somewhere.
Wow, yeah.
Which, I think, according to these scientists, the main ingredient for a perfect pop song is catchiness. It's something that's easy to recall, but also there's a key element of catchiness is surprise. So the challenge of keeping the listener on their toes, which triggers, the brain's reward pathways.
It's almost like comedy, right? Like that's the surprise of those.
That's a good point. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, like the punchline, isn't it?
Yeah.
So a song composed of a seamless sequence of surprising chords is, manna from heaven as far as pop songs are concerned. And that particular song, Oblidi Oblada, they were going to, it's a very spontaneous sounding song, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And they were going to ditch it until apparently John Lennon got to the piano and started doing a parody of what in Britain we call music hall, which is like very theatrical, old school Victorian entertainment in theatres. and conjured up a kind of Jamaican ska tribute at the same time by this pounding piano, which is where. So again, it's to do with goofing around, by the way.
Right. Wow. Yeah.
And produced a very commercial track. And it's typical of the Beatles, by the way, that they didn't actually take that song and have a hit with it themselves. I was thinking, William, when people talk about 3-album runs, and one thinks about maybe Rubber Soul Revolver and Sgt. Pepper, one of the greatest singles ever recorded, in my opinion, which is Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane, were the first things recorded during the Sgt. Pepper, famous, legendary Sgt. Pepper recordings, but they're not even on that album because they felt it would be cheating the record buying public to put singles they'd already bought on the album, which then followed it. And you think, wow, imagine Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane also being on Sgt. Pepper. I find that quite remarkable.
Yeah, that's something else.
That idea of their idea at that time, once the touring had finished in '66, their idea was to create songs about, like the Beatles song "In My Life," which is kind of nostalgic and kind of haunting in a way. The idea for Sgt. Pepper was to record songs which were backward-looking in terms of memory and childhood, which I think Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields both do. Strawberry Fields does it in a very haunting way, in a very odd way. It's a very ghostly kind of track, in fact. And again, perfectly produced by George Martin.
It's psychologically a very complex track too. Like, I think I know, like, there's all kinds of self-questioning, and the psychology of the lyrics is something else in Strawberry Fields Forever.
Yeah, also, there's some very odd vocal, not mannerisms, but verbal sentences where he says, "Ah, yes, I know of thee. Oh, of course." Some very odd things that you would say in the song. It's like he's thinking about it off the top of his head. Apparently, when you look into the construction of the song, Strawberry Fields is an orphan school in Liverpool. So there's an element of, there's a girls' orphan school, I think. There's an element of that, which has kind of got a Alice in Wonderland element to it. And there's also the existentialist, probably marijuana-influenced thoughts of John Lennon at the same time coexisting in the same song. It's also a famous example of when George Martin asked John Lennon which takes of the song he liked the middle bit of one version and another bit of another version, and the two wouldn't match up. So they made them match up, even though there were different instruments and different paces on the song. They somehow managed to get them to fit. It's a remarkable song, actually, and I never get bored of listening to the thing.
I don't either. I actually have listened to it within the last year. I just is on my rotation, just listening to the sophistication, how it progresses through the different lyrics, set of lyrics is really just incredible. I mean, their music is brilliant.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? I think they did a lot of research into the ways that the songs would come over on the radio. You don't just record it, but I was told once, when we sat down, we're watching television, and then you've got the volume of the telly on at a particular volume, and then the adverts always seem to be louder. And somebody told me the reason for that is that the sound is engineered on the adverts into a narrower sound wave band, so it sounds louder, even though it isn't.
Interesting.
So I understand that George Martin and his recording team did that kind of thing as well, so to look at the impactful nature of the song when it actually comes on the radio.
Wow, fascinating. That's some of the great stuff they did behind the scenes. I mean, it's really incredible. My understanding of the science of music, just as a basic level, is that the human brain likes repetition, but then also variance. So it's some kind of like science of our interpretation of hearing sound and digesting sound. What are your thoughts on kind of the theory of music and why why do some people obsess with music? What great musicians? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I started looking into, during the course of the book, why do humans even like music in the first place? And if we understand that, maybe we can understand more about why people like Beatles music. But actually, scientists don't know why humans like music. There's no fixed theory. So in human evolution, music stands out as a big mystery. Everybody loves it. All humans love it, from infancy through to old age, all around the world in different cultures. We all love music. It's a big part of everybody, most people's lives. You can think of somebody who doesn't have music in their lives, you think that's a bit odd. And yet, how it might have contributed to survival and evolution, human evolution, remains a bit of a mystery because there's no use to it, is there, particularly, William? So it's a bit, given it's a human universal, it makes you wonder why on earth we do it. So there are a number of theories about it, and I thought, in some sense, I didn't want to get dragged down into these very kind of dry and dusty theories. There's one called the credible, you can see immediately we get bogged down into academia. There's one called, a theory called the credible signaling hypothesis. It's not even a friendly phrase, right? And it's basically that music evolved to communicate a kind of honest information from the music giver to the music receiver, other humans, in other words, whether that's like a rhythmic performance in terms of drumming or group singing. And the idea is that we are communicating a little bit like bird song, except, of course, bird song is basically one bird saying to another, get off my tree, rather than get off my cloud. That music, human music, had evolved to signal the strength of the group or the coalition or the community, and basically saying it's an honest indicator of a group's intent to cooperate with others. And, a lullaby like Golden Slumbers on Abbey Road, what the scientists call infant-directed singing, a lullaby, is a signal of a caregiver's commitment to their offspring. You see, scientists can often kill any subject with the way the language that they use. I feel it's always better to kind of engage in the songs themselves. You know what I mean? Rather than the dry theory of it. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. I think, but it is such a component of our lives. I think it gives you an alternate state when you're listening to music. I'm thinking of the White Album because you almost listen to the White Album lying on your back, just trying to digest all this kind of postmodern whatever stuff. Like you're in a state where, what are they thinking? What's this music? What are these sounds? So I think maybe that is a component of music's interest, is the ability to either elevate you to aggression, nostalgia, romanticism, whatever.
I mean, the opening track on the White Album is another good example of the Beatles goofing around, because Back in the USSR is an example of a Beatles comedy song. It's a mick take of the Beach Boys and Chuck Berry at the same time. So it's a Mickey take of California Girls, but it's a title borrowed from Chuck Berry's Back in the USA, I should say. So the Beatles thought it would be funny to have a song about, at the time in the Soviet Union, life was meant to be grey and drab. So they thought it would be funny to sing about back in the USSR. So again, it's a kind of comedy track. Drive My Car is a comedy track as well, when you think about it. Because the entire thing about the song, with the very infectious beep, 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 yeah, the song is about some girl who decides she wants this guy as a driver, but she hasn't got a car, but she's got to drive, and that's a start. I mean, that's the punchline, right? And Norwegian Wood is a slightly weird comedy song because it's about John Lennon's illicit love affair, which ends up at the end of the song, if you listen to it carefully, that he burns down the house, which is the Norwegian Wood, isn't it?
That's the symbol of the burning, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. I lit the fire isn't good. Yeah.
And I mean, I think that mirth is like a subtext of all the Beatles stuff. And I think that's the thing. That's the theory of music. That's the science of it, is like transposing this, experience in the music to somebody else. I mean, think about Beethoven or even other musicians. the ability to transfer that over miles and space into somebody else's mind is
Absolutely, yeah.
extraordinary. Yeah.
And you often see by Liverpool, the city of Liverpool within Britain, if you see comedians, British comedians, or any comedians for that matter, who are touring the UK, and they talk about Liverpool, how what a difficult place it is to play, because in Liverpool everybody is a comedian, or at least everybody thinks they're a comedian. So they're a very tough audience. So again, to that extent, it's the Beatles being products of the city they come from.
Wow, fascinating. It's amazing. And their age and their youth and the fact that they're not trained in the hands of a guy who's a super sophisticated musician. Like all these things came together to just make this extraordinary
Yeah, that's
band.
isn't it? It's the interesting. I saw John Lennon in an interview from about the mid-70s where he talks about going up to George Martin and saying, "Well, we'd like to do this, George," and then John does an impersonation of George, sounding very posh, very English, upper class.
Right.
So that meeting of the creativity and the untrained innocence of not being formally trained with somebody who says, "Oh, I see what you mean." But of course, that's where George Martin plays an important role, isn't it? He can't be stayed in, mentally stayed about what they want to do. He's receptive and open-minded to the creativity. That's an important part, isn't it?
Yeah, I think Martin was like a member of the British aristocracy or something, wasn't he? I think he came from a wealthy background, if I remember. Maybe I don't know.
He's certainly posher than the Beatles anyway, because Liverpool is a very working class city, and as I said before, with a 3/4 Irish ancestry. So
it is remarkable because he lived a long life. He lived till 2016, so he saw the whole rise and fall and the fame, the continuing fame of the Beatles all the way, for decades. Mark, we are at the 50-minute mark. It's great to talk with you. Congrats on the new book. Literally, I just told people at the intro just dropped here or was released here in the States on Amazon 2 days ago. Is there anything you'd like to add or anything you'd like to summarize or anything I missed?
Well, I just wanted to say that if people are interested in the Beatles and about why the Beatles are still popular, a good example of why they're still popular, we mentioned the fact that Beyonce had recorded a version of Blackbird, and the Beatles stuff is still in the pipeline. They had that song which they used AI to record now and then, didn't they, last year? And the Oscar-winning film director, Sam Mendes, is about to make, which I think is incredible, 4 separate biopic movies about the Beatles, one movie from each of the band's perspective, which will be released in 2027. So the legend lives on, I guess.
Yeah, still relevant, still relevant. And where can people find this and your other books? Like I'll put a link to your Amazon page so people can check out your other books in this kind of the science of series.
Yeah, that's the best place to get
Best
them.
place is Amazon.
Yeah.
And if anybody wants to reach out to you, are you on social media or email or do you have any?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram and I'm on X, as they call it these days.
X. All right. So I'll put a link to that, Mark. I'll put a link to your X account if people want to reach out to you or talk about the book. But thanks again for your time. Congrats on the book. And the full title of the book, again, is The Science of the Beatles, the Technology and Theory Behind the Music and Lyrics. And the authors are Mark Brake and Jeff Brake. And we talked to Mark today. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, William.
All right. Stay there. Stay there.